In 1631, shortly after 2 a.m., the village of Baltimore on Ireland's southern coast erupted in terror. North African raiders were breaking down doors throughout the settlement. They pulled families from their beds, bound them with chains in the mud streets as flames consumed their cottages. When the sun rose, all 237 of them were gone, locked in the hold of a ship sailing toward Algeria. One of them was a young woman named Joan Broadbrook. She had spent her entire life within walking distance of her birthplace. The idea that strangers from an unknown continent would drag her away in darkness had never crossed her mind. 21 days later, Joan found herself standing on an auction block in the markets of Algiers, displayed like merchandise. Buyers walked circles around her, examining her the way farmers assessed livestock at a fair. They grabbed her limbs, pressed their fingers into her flesh, inspected her as though she were cargo, because that's exactly what she had become. Her price, roughly 8 oxen. You could buy a better horse for more, and Joan was far from unique. From 1530 to 1780, the Barbary coast slave trade consumed over 1 million European souls. Victims came from Spain, Italy, France, and territories as remote as Iceland and the Irish coast. This is the history that Europe buried, because facing it meant facing an uncomfortable truth. For 2.5 centuries, the Mediterranean operated as a marketplace where European flesh was the commodity, and the fate that awaited women inside the harems. That's the part they really don't want you to learn. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the like button. This channel drags the ugliest truths out of history's shadows. To grasp what Joan and countless others experienced, you first need to understand their captors. The Barbary corsairs weren't disorganized bandits. They were government-funded predators launching operations from fortified ports in Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and the Ottoman Empire sponsored them openly. Every human being sold generated revenue for the Sultan's treasury. This wasn't mere piracy. It was organized commerce. Their fleets approached European shores in formations of 30 vessels or more. They struck during darkness or at first light when coastal communities lay defenseless. They grabbed anything valuable: gold, silver, provisions. But humans remained their primary cargo, because a human being generated profit repeatedly. Consider what that means. In the eyes of these raiders, you weren't a person. You were a financial asset, a commodity with ongoing value. Something to capture, trade, exploit, and trade again until you had nothing left to give. In 1627, their ships reached Iceland, Europe's northernmost inhabited territory. They seized 400 souls from an island that most Europeans had never heard of. Picture an Icelandic shepherd jolted awake by Arabic-speaking warriors smashing through his door. Men from a landmass he couldn't have located if his life depended on it. In 1544, the legendary corsair Hareem Barbarossa swept along the Italian coastline and carried off 7,000 captives in a single season. 7,000 human beings. That's not raiding, that's reaping. In 1554, corsairs descended on the Spanish coastal town of Vest and removed 6,000 residents. The entire population vanished overnight. None of this was random violence. These were calculated military strikes aimed at specific demographics. Young females and children commanded premium prices, so young females and children were the primary targets. Now picture yourself living along the Spanish or Italian coastline during these centuries. Every evening you closed your eyes wondering whether this was the night, whether you'd jolt awake to shrieking, whether tomorrow's sunrise would find you shackled below deck on a vessel bound for nightmares. For 250 years, that fear was daily reality. Whole fishing communities emptied out, families abandoned the shore and retreated inland, beyond the corsairs' grasp. Lookout towers sprouted along every Mediterranean coastline to spot approaching sails. Church bells served as alarm systems, but early warning couldn't guarantee safety. The corsairs learned to adapt. They studied which settlements lacked proper fortifications. They paid local criminals for intelligence. They timed their raids for stormy weather when fishing boats couldn't escape harbor. Then they struck. Some Europeans known as renegades converted to Islam and enlisted with the corsairs themselves. They brought in valuable knowledge, European languages, European habits, European vulnerabilities. They served as guides and interpreters during raids. The most notorious was a Dutch sea captain called Simon the Dancer. He defected to Algiers and built himself a fortune in the slave trade. He personally delivered thousands of his own countrymen to the auction blocks. Gold erases loyalty. Nationality becomes meaningless when fortunes hang in the balance, and fortunes were definitely in play. Let me introduce another woman. Maria Ter Meetelen, Dutch, seized in 1731 at age 22 while aboard a trading vessel near Spanish waters. Pirates stormed the ship at daybreak. Males over 40 received no consideration. Too old for labor, too old for sail. Their corpses went into the water. Younger men were shackled. Every female was shackled. Then the ship changed course for Africa. Maria endured 17 days confined in that ship's cargo hold, chained beside 40 other women. The quarters were so cramped that lying flat was impossible. They sat doubled over against one another in pitch blackness. The stench defied description. Vomit, human waste, the smell of pure terror, zero light, zero ventilation. Nothing but the groaning of timber and women weeping in languages she couldn't identify. Several women died during passage. Their chains were removed and their bodies hauled topside. Maria listened to the splashes as corpses hit the water. She tracked 7 splashes across those 17 days. 7 women swallowed by the Mediterranean. A woman chained beside her refused food on day 3, refused water on day 5. By day 8, she was dead. Maria sat shackled to that corpse for hours before anyone bothered to drag it away. When they finally made port in Algiers, guards hauled her onto the deck. She hadn't glimpsed daylight in more than 2 weeks. The brightness stabbed at her eyes like hot needles. The first image her adjusting vision registered was the gleaming white architecture of Algiers blazing under the sun. The second was the slave market. The operation ran with cold efficiency. New arrivals were marched to public bathhouses, scrubbed clean, wounds patched just enough to prevent death before sale. Then came the sorting. Exactly like livestock, fit young males went to back-breaking labor or galley duty, chained to oars, rowing until their bodies collapsed. Galley slaves rarely survived beyond 5 years. Locked in position, barely fed, worked until death. Educated males fetched higher prices as private tutors or skilled craftsmen. Better conditions, better food, still human property. Children were groomed for household service. The youngest were sometimes converted and raised under a new religion. They grew up with no memory of their origins, no knowledge of their birth names. Females past 35 went to domestic servitude, kitchen work, scrubbing floors, the unseen drudgery of wealthy homes. But females between 15 and 30, they represented the highest value inventory in the entire marketplace. Their destination was the harems. The sale itself followed the inspection. Women climbed onto a raised platform at the market center. Prospective owners circled them, evaluating hands, squeezed limbs to gauge muscle. Fingers pried mouths open to examine teeth. Eyes scanned every surface of exposed skin for illness or imperfection. And at numerous markets, particularly in Algiers and Tunis, women were displayed, without any covering for inspection, completely exposed, nothing obscured. Buyers touched bodies that weren't theirs to touch, explored whatever they wished. A French monk named Pierre Dan conducted rescue missions for Christian captives in Algiers during 1634. He documented everything he witnessed. He recorded that Christian women stood fully exposed in crowded plazas, examined no differently than animals. Buyers probed every part of their bodies to confirm health. Young women sobbed, but resistance brought immediate violence. Slavers beat them until they understood that defiance accomplished nothing. None of this was concealed. It occurred under the midday sun, in open public spaces, observed by thousands of witnesses, perfectly legal, perfectly ordinary. Now imagine yourself as Joan Broadbrook positioned on that platform, a young woman from a speck of an Irish village where every face was familiar, where her greatest concern had been rainfall and crop yields, where no male outside her family had ever laid hands on her. Now foreign strangers speaking incomprehensible sounds were handling her body, calculating her value with their eyes. She was purchased by a Turkish trader called Ahmed Price, 8 oxen. She understood nothing about what this meant, nothing about the 7 other slaves Ahmed already owned. nothing about the permanent end of everything she'd ever known. The voyage from Algiers to Istanbul consumed 6 weeks. Joan spent it in another ship's cargo hold, alongside 20 other European females, this time women from Italy, Spain, France, Greece. Not one spoke English. Real communication was hopeless, but terror requires no shared language. Every woman understood what lay ahead. The stories had reached them all. Survivors among them attempted to demonstrate through hand gestures what to expect. Their movements conveyed horrors that spoken words couldn't express. Upon reaching Istanbul, they were delivered immediately to Ahmed's residence. Fellow slaves descended on Joan at once. They stripped away her European garments and fed them to the flames. Every physical trace of her former existence reduced to ash. They immersed her in fragrant bath water, wrapped her in Ottoman fabrics. The reflection facing her was a stranger. That evening, Ahmed entered her quarters. Joan had never known a man physically, never found herself alone with any male beyond her relatives. Back in Ireland, such intimacy followed marriage vows. With a partner you selected, someone who spoke your tongue and knew your name. Ahmed knew no English. He required none. Years afterward, Joan succeeded in sending one letter home to Ireland. It stands as one of the only surviving first-hand testimonies from a captured Irish woman. She wrote that words couldn't capture what she endured that initial night, only that she begged for death countless times. Death never answered, and every subsequent night brought the same suffering. That was harem reality. Not cushioned divans and fragrant courtyards. Not the fanciful artwork European painters invented without ever witnessing their subject. Not romanticized luxury, captivity, compulsory submission, bare survival, and the mental anguish of comprehending this was permanent. No deliverance approached. No military expedition mounted rescue. No possibility remained of returning home. Only formless days stretching into formless years. Some women lost their sanity, shrieking at empty walls, conversing with invisible companions. Fellow slaves restrained them until exhaustion took over. Those beyond control were resold or simply vanished. Others constructed internal survival mechanisms, repetitive routines, minor daily rituals providing structure where none existed, mental replays of childhood songs, their mothers cooking, rainfall drumming on roof thatch, anything preserving connection to former selves. Most simply stopped feeling. Numbness was easier. A slave's daily existence hinged entirely upon her owner. But certain patterns recurred everywhere. First, relentless pressure to abandon Christianity. Converting didn't bring freedom. Converted slaves remained property, but conversion marginally elevated household standing. Those refusing faced punishment, physical beatings, starvation, weeks locked in lightless chambers. Second, mandatory language acquisition, Turkish or Arabic, depending on final destination. Quick learners earned marginally gentler treatment. Slow learners or those refusing to try were labeled defiant, troublesome. They received harsher discipline until compliance or collapse. Third, critically important, European slaves possessed zero legal standing. Testimony in court was prohibited. Property ownership was prohibited. Refusing an owner anything was prohibited. Leaving the residence unaccompanied was prohibited. Under every applicable law, she was an object, an item, possessions ranking no higher than furniture. Most women landed in one of three circumstances: crushing household labor, mopping, cooking, minding children, 16-hour shifts without pause, frequent punishment for minor errors, scorching a meal earned beatings. Breaking a dish meant days without food. These women seldom glimpsed the world beyond their walls. They deteriorated rapidly. Once labor capacity failed, they were resold to poorer households or discarded into the streets. Sexual servitude. Attractive young women served their owners' desires on demand. Wealthy households maintained multiple concubines competing for attention and favor. Bearing a male child elevated status, perhaps even winning small privileges. Female children counted for less. Repeated failures meant resale or reassignment to housework. Repeated sales. Numerous slaves changed hands multiple times across their lifetimes. Every transaction meant fresh trauma, fresh public exposure, fresh masters bringing fresh expectations and fresh varieties of cruelty. Some women were bought and sold 5, 6, even 10 separate times. Each transaction reset everything. New regulations to memorize, new requirements to satisfy, new strategies for surviving until tomorrow. But one destination eclipsed all others in terror: the Imperial Harem within the Ottoman Sultan's Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The harem wasn't one structure. It was an immense compound sprawling across the palace grounds, 400 chambers, interior courtyards, bathhouses, cooking facilities, landscaped grounds. During peak periods, between 500 and 1,000 women occupied it simultaneously, an entire city populated exclusively by females, every last one classified as property. Most weren't European. Circassian and Georgian women from Caucasus territories predominated, considered supreme beauties by Ottoman aesthetic standards, but European captives existed within those walls, scarce and therefore precious. Reaching the Imperial Harem required extraordinary physical beauty, extreme youth, typically ages 12 through 18, and successful navigation of a merciless elimination process. Agents acting for the Sultan scoured slave markets throughout Ottoman domains seeking prospects. They purchased the most promising candidates and transported them to the palace for extended evaluation. Bodily examinations far more invasive than public market inspections, assessment of temperament, intelligence testing, health verification, capacity to provide satisfaction. The majority failed selection and were resold elsewhere. Only a tiny fraction gained admission. For those admitted, conditioning commenced. The process consumed years. We often imagine the Ottoman Sultan's harem as a place of luxury, romance and intrigue, but the reality for the vast majority of women who lived there was far from this fantasy. Let's uncover the devastating truth. New arrivals to the harem were put through an intense education. They learned the Turkish language, Ottoman court etiquette, music, dance, and even calligraphy. Instructors drilled them on everything from proper posture to the precise way to meet a man's gaze and the correct way to look away. The goal was to transform them from captives into cultivated companions worthy of a sultan. But here's the crushing reality that shatters every romanticized notion. The harem housed between 500 and 1,000 women. Of that number, maybe 50 to 100 would ever even see the sultan. And of those, only a tiny fraction, perhaps 5 to 10 in an entire generation, would actually share his bed. So what happened to everyone else? They existed in a state of suspended animation. They weren't free, but they also weren't fulfilling the one role that supposedly justified their captivity. Years, sometimes decades, passed by as they waited for a summons that never came. They aged inside gilded chambers, watching their youth and beauty fade, knowing that each passing year made their chances even slimmer. When a sultan died, any woman who hadn't borne him a child was moved to the old palace. This was a separate, even more secluded compound where they would live out the rest of their days. They never left, they never married, they never had children. They simply existed behind stone walls, waiting for death. Ottoman archives tell the story of a European woman known only as Francesca. She entered the harem in 1650 at the age of 15. She died within those same walls in 1702 at age 67. 52 years, she never once met the Sultan. Her entire life's purpose was to serve the women who outranked her. When she died, she was buried in a graveyard for palace slaves. Her grave had no name, just a number. Administrative documents simply recorded: Slave 847, origin Frankish territories, status deceased, cause old age. Half a century of a human life, compressed into a few cold words on a ledger. That was the true reality of the Imperial Harem, not power and splendor, but a gilded cage where thousands of women simply vanished, leaving nothing behind. It's a dark history that makes you wonder, why was this system tolerated for so long? Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe for more hidden histories. The explanation brings no honor. Europe remained fractured and feeble. Catholic-Protestant warfare devoured every available resource. Nations couldn't unite against corsair threats because they were consumed by mutual destruction. Certain European powers, Venice and France particularly, maintained lucrative commercial arrangements with Ottoman territories. They refused to jeopardize profitable relationships over abducted commoners and fishing families, and certain Europeans directly profited from the system. Renegades operated as corsairs and accumulated wealth. Traders conducted business with North African ports regardless of merchandise origins. Ransoming captives evolved into a dedicated industry. Catholic religious orders, Trinitarians and Mercedarians solicited contributions throughout Europe specifically to purchase slaves' freedom. But ransom procedures moved slowly, choked by bureaucracy and heavily favored wealth. A prosperous merchant's daughter might return within months. A poor fisherman's wife might wait until death. Most waited until death. Maria Ter Meetelen numbered among the fortunate minority. Following 8 years of captivity, her family liquidated every possession they owned to accumulate ransom funds. 200 Dutch florins, an astronomical sum for a working family. Her release came in 1739. She returned to Holland, but arrival brought devastating discoveries. Her betrothed had married someone else. Her mother had died from heartbreak 2 years following the abduction. Her father had bankrupted himself assembling ransom money, and her community shunned her. They viewed her as soiled, disgraced. No man would marry a former slave. Assumptions about her experiences, accurate or otherwise, stained her permanently. Maria spent remaining years in solitude, earning wages as a seamstress. Her diary, preserved in Dutch archives, records that she would have preferred dying in captivity over returning to such existence. At least overseas, her shame remained private. Here, it followed her everywhere, forever. Circumstances shifted only during the 19th century when French naval forces began shelling corsair strongholds. In 1830, France invaded Algeria and dismantled the system permanently. By then, more than 1 million souls had been seized. The overwhelming majority never returned. Joan Broadbrook endured years of captivity. Upon eventual release, she attempted returning to Ireland, but Baltimore had ceased to exist. Her home, her community, her relatives, everything erased. Surviving family members never discovered her fate. For decades, priests read her name during Baltimore church services, prayers offered for captured souls. Every Sunday her name pronounced aloud. Every Sunday, silence in response. Eventually, they stopped including her. She faded from memory entirely. This extends beyond Joan's story, beyond Maria's, beyond Francesca's. This is the story of more than 1 million European women whose existences were stolen by a human trafficking operation that functioned openly across centuries. Ireland's coastlines still remember that night in 1631. Istanbul's archives still contain the slaves' names. And now you remember too. Every civilization harbors chapters this dark. Histories buried in a waiting excavation. Which civilization should we dig into next? Tell me in the comments. If you want the history others refuse to tell, subscribe to the Obscure Chronicles. We don't look away.